Sinan, just describe for us your literary life. When did you start writing poetry and fiction?
I started writing poetry when I was a teenager because in Iraq and the Arab world, and I guess in the Arab or Islamic world, everyone wants to be a poet and then they give up, but I didn't give up. But I started writing poetry first and then tried writing short stories, but I did not publish anything while in Iraq because the culture was geared towards war and glorifying the leader. So I published a few things in Paris, in an Arabic language journal in Paris. But of course, studying literature in Baghdad and being part of that culture was very important for me. Growing up in an environment where poetry was, like bread. Then left and started writing more poetry, but published my first novel in 2002 in Beirut, which was called I'Jam, or Iraqi Rhapsody in the English translation, about the plight of a young man who was put in prison under Saddam's time, and he kind of disappears into the Kafkaesque world. But the second novel was in 2002 is called The Pomegranate Alone, but the English title is The Corpse Washer. It was an attempt to somehow come to terms with all of the death and destruction that had taken place in Iraq.
Explain to our audience what a corpse washer
is. The Islamic tradition of corpse washing is very intricate and very delicate. But it's very intricate and beautiful and poetic ritual of shrouding and, certain incantations and certain incense that is used.
As the dead body is being washed and cleansed.
Yes, and then prepared for the grave. But I read this story about a corpse washer in his early 30s, in the first 2 years of the occupation of Iraq, who had been making so much money because so many people were dying, but he was psychologically destroyed and wanted to leave the country so that his son would not inherit this profession. Because he said that under dictatorship, as horrible as it was, there would be 1 or 2 bodies a day. But nowadays, he was saying that so many bodies were coming. And that really struck me, and it struck me right there. I knew that I wanted to write a novel because that would be an excellent metaphor for what was happening in Iraq. But I changed things around, whereby my narrator is someone who grows up in this kind of family, but is neither religious nor does he want to do that. He wants to be an artist. Instead of death, he wants to create life. But dictatorship, war, and sanctions, overdetermine the fact that even though he studies art at the academy in Baghdad, but later he is forced to actually go back and do the same profession that his father wanted him to, but he resisted. And then the third novel is about 2 generations of a Christian family. An older man who has seen better times and can imagine a non-sectarian Iraq, and his young relative who grew up in the times of war and sanctions, and she herself suffered from these sectarian attacks and kind of has internalized a Christian sectarian identity. So it's the relationship between the two, and how they do not see history and do not see the present in the same way, even though they live in the same house.
Why don't you read us an extract from The Corpse Washer?
I won't think. Oh, so this is an encounter between the son and his father. I saw you at the Mghasl, father. It was my first time at work with you. Hamoudi was not with us, and it was pitch dark. You had a candle in your hand. I asked you, why don't we wait until it's morning and then start work? You smiled and said, there is nothing but night here. I was surprised and asked why. You said, have you forgotten that we are in the underworld, my son, and the sun does not rise here? I felt a lump in my throat and a tear found its way to my cheek. You wiped it and hugged me, saying in an unusually loving tone, don't worry, dear. Candles are enough for us to do our work and live a good life. You'll get used to their light. It was the first time you ever called me dear. You asked me to follow you and showed me the bench and said, this is where we put together the body parts. Al-Fartusi brings every day. I was surprised that Al-Fartusi was here as well. You pointed to the cupboards, which I couldn't see clearly, and said, the needles, threads, and glue are all there. Then you pointed to wooden boxes which were stacked on the floor and said, the feathers we used to cover the bodies are all in there. I asked, why do we have to cover their bodies with feathers? You smiled and said, do you still ask too many questions, son? This is what our ancestors did before and what our grandchildren will keep doing. You moved toward one of the cupboards and opened it. You took out a candle and lit it with the flame in your candle and handed it to me. I held it in my hand. Its flame illuminated more of the place. I saw legs and arms stacked in the corner and asked you about them. We will find a place for them in the bodies that come every day. What about Amouri and Hamoudi and the others? Are they here too? You didn't answer. I saw an eye hanging on the wall by a thread and shedding tears. When I asked you about it, you said, it longs for another eye, or perhaps it is crying for the sun. I asked you, are we alive or dead, Father? You didn't answer and blew out your candle, and mine died too. I stayed alone in the dark listening to the tears falling from the eye on the wall until I woke up. The candle next to my head was choking and about to give out.
It's interesting, Sinan, that, Arab novelists such as yourself and of course others, it's awful to say this, I know, but these horrors and tragedies, as is often the case, are producing a very different literature to that being produced, for instance, in the United States. Even with some of the most praised writers in the United States, they cannot bring themselves to write about what their country is doing in other parts of the world. In a way, it's a very sort of provincialized literature that is now being produced in the States, which wasn't the case, by the way, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. This is something very specific to today.
Well, I think maybe it's this neoliberal moment as well, or phase, but definitely, I mean, I was just saying this yesterday, in that it's amazing how many writers and poets are completely disengaged, not only from what the United States empire is doing abroad, but from the visceral issues of their society, where you read their novels and you think that race or class are not issues. They're all, bourgeois fantasies or, the middle America type of life. And that I completely agree with you. And, I feel guilty sometimes saying it out loud, but it's true. And they have a luxury, perhaps, that other writers in other parts of the world cannot avail themselves of. And, there is an amnesia in the US too, where, as you said, they have forgotten the legacy and tradition of writers who were great writers and poets, but who were viscerally engaged in the struggles and in being citizens, basically. I mean, I think it goes back to being citizens who are asleep, who don't realize what power they have potentially. This is the first thing that struck me, leaving Iraq as a dictatorship and going to the United States in 1991, and I realized that whenever I exercise my freedom of speech and critique the United States, people feel uncomfortable. And I wondered then why, if the freedom of speech is not there to be exercised, is it just a decoration?
What is your last novel about? Ya Maryam, Ave Maria.
Well, Ave Maria, speaking of houses and homes and leaving home and the difficulty that so many Iraqis have had in being forced to leave their houses. So initially I wanted to write a novel about how a man who clings to his house in Baghdad and doesn't want to leave, which is an actual case of many people that I know who are still there now and don't want to leave. A man in his 70s who was a lower middle class Iraqi Christian, but he was Iraqi first, who lived through the monarchy and saw the revolution of 1958 and the rise of the Ba'athists, and was also a government official who worked in the authority when Iraq's economy used to depend also on exporting dates. So he has lived through all of this, and his siblings have left the country, but he doesn't want to leave Iraq and doesn't want to leave the house that he himself built, and believes that all of this will pass through. But his relative is a younger woman in her 20s who was born into the sanctions and into militia culture, and has seen these new government that is dominated by and has been exposed to this sectarian racist discourse, and sadly has internalized it like many Iraqis, and so has internalized this false notion that somehow, you know, there has been a transhistorical conflict between Muslims and Christians, or has lost her sense of Iraqi identity. And so it's the conversation between the two of them, basically. Their own memories conflict, and she accuses him of living in the past. And he also cannot see what she sees as a woman who's living the reality. And then their fates converge actually with the infamous bombing of a famous church in Baghdad, which was one of the first acts of the Islamic State, the predecessor of ISIS.
And this novel is being published in Arabic and Spanish?
It was published in Arabic 2 years ago and was shortlisted for the so-called Arabic Booker, and came out last year in Spanish in Madrid, and was translated into English but has not yet been published in English.
Why is this?
Well, I coined the term, I'm not going to talk about the so-called forensic interest in Arab culture. And also, there is this sense that exists with a lot of publishers that if you've read one Syrian novel or two, that's enough. So largely, Arabic literature is not really dealt with on equal footing with other literatures. We still have Orientalism and its resilience. And Edward Said once said it's embargoed literature. Things have improved, but they haven't improved that much as far as I'm concerned. Especially in a place like the United States, where I think when they have destroyed Iraq twice already, I naively expect them to have some interest in the culture of the places they destroyed. But as one publisher said to my agent or another, well, I published an Iraqi novel 2 years ago, so why would I publish another one? As if so the Iraqis will publish one novel. It goes back to the fact that others are one-dimensional and not really full human beings. And if you only need to read one of their authors, and that's enough.